I'm sure this is going to be a great conversation. This was planned actually some while ago at a very different moment in the history of the Middle East, and I think it would have been a different conversation. And so it is a kind of ancillary benefit of the tremendous upheaval that the Middle East has witnessed over the last month or two, that this talk that we're having is suddenly just immensely more urgent and more dramatic than it might have been otherwise. And we've been very fortunate in getting three extremely distinguished guests. And so what I'd like to do is first give an extremely brief introduction to each of our three guests, and then the four of us or I will moderate a conversation amongst them for 45 minutes to an hour. I'm sure that there'll be lots of questions among all of you, so I'll make sure that we all stop with plenty of time for questions. So let me just first very briefly introduce our three distinguished guests. To my far right is Marina Ottaway. Marina is the director of the Middle East program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a longtime analyst of the formation and transformation of political systems. She has also written on political reconstruction in Iraq, Afghanistan, the Balkans, and African countries. Her most recent publications include Getting to Pluralism, co-authored with Amr Hamzawi, and Yemen on the Brink, co-edited with Christopher Busek. And I should just add that Marina is someone whose work I've cited or stolen from on many occasions, so I'm really happy to have her here. Next to Marina's left is Mohamad Bazzi of NYU. Mohamad's an assistant professor of journalism here at NYU, and he's also an adjunct senior fellow for Middle East Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations. From 2003 until 2007, he was the Middle East bureau chief at Newsday, based in Beirut and responsible for covering the Arab world. He's written for the New York Times Magazine, The Nation, Newsweek, The Wall Street Journal, and others. And finally, immediately to my right is Marc Lynch. Marc is an assistant professor at George Washington University, and he's the director of the Institute for Middle East Studies there. He blogs for foreignpolicy.com, and he edits its must-read Middle East channel. He's also a non-resident senior fellow at the Center for a New American Security. In an earlier incarnation as a blogger, Marc was known as Abu Aardvark, which my small knowledge of Arabic implies to me that his son is an aardvark. So maybe I've always wondered what that meant.
I've got pictures to prove it.
So, okay, well, maybe you'll explain to us at some point in the course of the evening how that came to be. So let me first ask all of you to engage in the following exercise. If you think about the countries whose future now seems to be so much in play, and that would of course include Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, Bahrain, Jordan, maybe Oman, maybe others, which is the one that you are the most optimistic about the future of? Which is the one that you entertain the gravest nightmare scenarios for? So why don't we start with Marina and then work our way back?
Okay. Since I tend to look at the dark side of things, let me start with the ones I'm most pessimistic about. And I would put Libya and Yemen, because my concern there is that if the two regimes fall, and in a sense, I hope they will fall. They are not regimes that one wants to see staying in power. The state will disintegrate, because these are countries that do not really have a strong state structure. They do not have a strong administrative structure. What holds the country together is personal relations established between Gaddafi and the tribes, Gaddafi and various military groups. The same in Yemen, essentially. It's a network of tribal linkages and so on. You remove Saleh in Yemen, you remove Gaddafi in Libya, and you really risk finding yourself in a situation similar to that of Somalia. In other words, the state, it's not just the removal of a regime with the state staying intact, it's the state disintegrating. I don't think you build a democracy or a democratic future under those conditions, not very easily. If you look at the other extreme, I think we are looking at Tunisia and Egypt. But let me take Egypt as the sort of the model, if you want. Egypt is an extremely strong state. It has existed since the days of the pharaohs. I mean, it's not that it is a very bureaucratic state. It has a very strong administrative structure. Is it efficient? No, it's not. It's not. Is it, is a state that's well administered? Not. But it's a state where that reaches out in all sectors of life. And that state is not going to disappear. Similarly, the regime is still in power in Egypt. I think this is something that people have not discussed sufficiently. The regime had a great deal of depth, it's almost like an onion. It had many layers in it. And what has happened so far is the top layer has been peeled off. They pitched Mubarak, and then they started peeling off the top layers of the leadership of the party. But the party is still there. They are talking about regrouping and presenting candidates in the forthcoming elections. And the military is still intact. So that the problem there is it's difficult to change the situation. But if the protest continues, and that's where the optimism comes in, if the protest continues, and the opposition succeeds in forcing more concessions from the military, and you can see a slow erosion, step by step. It's even clearer in Tunisia. Then I think the possibility of a democratic transformations exist, because you still have a state structure that could become democratic rather than having completely.
Well, that was as you say, since your tendency is pessimistic, that was a duly cautionary form of optimism, because obviously the metaphor of the onion means that there's a great deal that is intact about the state, which until now has been, of course, the obstacle to democratic reform in Egypt. So, Mohamad.
Okay, I'll start with the nightmare scenarios too. I guess we're not going to have too much disagreement on the panel tonight. I think Libya and Yemen, I would add Bahrain. Marina covered Libya and Yemen quite well. On Bahrain, my worry is the sectarian overtones that the conflict in Bahrain has taken on, and that we haven't heard very much explanation of. And I also worry that it could become the new flashpoint between Iran and Saudi Arabia in the region. On the sectarian overtones, all of these revolutions so far, all these movements so far in Tunisia and Egypt and in Libya and Yemen. In Libya and Yemen, they may have taken on this tribal overtone. But the sectarian overtone in Bahrain, I think, is more dangerous because of the signal it sends to the rest of the region, because of the signal it also sends to Iraq and the Saudis. I have and I'm curious to hear Marc's thoughts on this. I have a very hard time seeing how the Saudis would allow a Shia-dominated government to take power in Bahrain. And I think they will go to great lengths to prevent that, and they might go to much greater lengths than they have gone in Iraq to prevent the inevitable Shia rise to power in Iraq. So that's my biggest nightmare. I'm optimistic on Egypt and Tunisia as well. I think the constitutional amendments that we saw proposed in Egypt yesterday were quite encouraging. This talk of term limits for the presidency, 2 term limits for the presidency, shortening the presidency to a 4-year term. These are all sort of encouraging signs, and we might see Egypt emerge with a kind of a clear-cut sort of separation of power. That might be too much. That might be a little too optimistic. But we might see Egypt emerge with a new system where there isn't this stranglehold on the presidency that we've had for all of these years.
All right, Mark?
That leaves me with the rest of the Arab world. It's funny. So when Jim poses the question the way that he does, optimistic and pessimistic, as a political scientist and analyst, I find myself like a deer in the headlights because I'm neither optimistic nor pessimistic. There's normative connotations there about where we want to end up, and I don't actually want that to blind me, and so that my hopes make me think that Egypt will work out or Tunisia will work out. And pessimistic, listening to Marina, it's not clear what the kind of outcome she's describing, if that's a good or a positive or a negative thing. So I'm going to take a step back and kind of and come at the question in a slightly different way, which is to say that if there's optimism here, the optimism lies in the fact that the change has begun. And I know I speak for Marina because we've been having these conversations for the last 6 or 7 years now. But everybody who studies this region in any serious way has spent a long time warning of the impending changes and saying that if Egypt doesn't reform, then everything's going to fall apart. And if Jordan doesn't become more democratic, then there will be the Hashemite monarchy will fall. And for so long, we were always, the sky is falling, and the sky never fell. Well, now the sky is falling. And then you have a choice of either embracing the reality of that change or rushing to kind of stuff it back in the bottle. I don't think there's any bottle stuffing to be done. I think that I can walk through the list of the countries, which I'm happy to do, and go through which ones I think which regimes I think will survive, which ones won't survive, which ones will manage to put off the day of reckoning for a while. But I think broadly speaking, the changes now are irreversible. I think that the empowerment of publics is going to be a new feature in all levels of politics, and that even the regimes that survive are going to behave differently in both foreign policy and their domestic politics out of fear of sparking an uprising of this newly empowered population, youth, and I don't even want to say youth because it's the entire population in many of these countries. And to me, I think that's a good thing because I think that even more than democracy defined in terms of elections or institutions, the greatest thing which I've always focused on is the ability of publics to have their views heard and have accountability of governments to the people. I think we're going to see that in most of these countries going forward. At the same time, the kinds of things which that's likely to lead to are not necessarily good things in many of the ways that we think about. So for instance, I think that if we get elections in Egypt, which I certainly hope that we do, I think it is highly likely that the Facebookiyin, as we call them, of Tahrir Square are going to lose, and lose badly. In free, fair elections, maybe they would win 2-3% of the vote and maybe get a member of parliament. Economic problems are not going to be solved. And there's going to be a real backlash against the outcome of those elections, I think, in almost any conceivable electoral scenario. And then you get what? You get ongoing turbulence. You get then a healthy institutionalized democracy. I'm really curious to push these questions a bit further. So that's why I have trouble with the optimism and pessimism thing, because I think that there's fundamental changes taking place, many of which I think are good things. But it's such a system-level change that it's going to play out in so many different ways in cross-cutting terms. If I have to put bullseye on regimes, I'd probably put them on Riyadh and possibly on Amman. I think that...
you mean in terms of places that are next that have not yet had that level of turbulence?
Yeah, I think Saudi Arabia is far more vulnerable than people want to admit. Far more vulnerable than Qatar or the UAE, or even Oman for that matter.
Why don't you say for a second why you think that's the case?
Sure. They have all the ingredients which make them ripe for uprisings are there. They have a large youth population, high levels of unemployment, a divided and aging elite which has failed to respond to popular demands for reform for years, heavily censored media, and great popular frustration with the enforcement of religious morality on a country which is widely exposed to alternative forms of life. All the ingredients are there. Overlay that on the Sunni-Shia divide and the persistent ongoing demands for reform from both religious figures and from Shia figures, and all the recipes, everything is there. The Saudis believe that they can solve that problem, like they can try and solve everything by throwing money at it. It rarely works, and it's probably not going to work here. Jordan, on the other hand, has been on the brink for so long that, they'll muddle through like they always do. So I think that Jordan is probably in for some turbulence, but I think they'll be okay. But the Saudis worry me because they're not used to bending, and that means they're more likely to break.
So, but let's talk a little bit then about the question of what might fill these vacuums if and when there are elections. So, a lot of the anxiety that you hear expressed in public has been about the idea that these autocratic states which have held fundamentalist Islam in check, that their fall will then produce a kind of windfall for fundamentalists, and people tend to talk about the Muslim Brotherhood as fundamentalists. So we could talk about different countries, but since Egypt is the one where so much of this debate has taken place, let's talk a little bit there about, I guess there are two parts to this. One, is the danger of fundamentalist or highly reactionary Islam gaining real popularity in a democratic system a very urgent one? And two, should we understand the Muslim Brotherhood as the carrier of that mentality? Either Mohamad or Marina, whichever one of you wants to take that.
Well, I think the issue of the Muslim Brotherhood, very frankly, is a red herring. That the idea that somehow this is the organization that's going to be the beneficiary of the unrest of the uprising in Egypt is really totally misplaced. As the idea, by the way, that has been set forth by quite a few writers recently, including in a recent article in the New York Times, that Iran is going to benefit from the uprising. It's not. What we have seen in recent the picture in Egypt for a long time has been one where the only mobilized opposition force was the Muslim Brotherhood. It was the best organized of the opposition forces. The secular parties were dead in the water. They were, to me, the epitome of that was the WAFT party, the old historic party that led the struggle for independence, that a few years ago finally renewed its leadership. And they moved from a 90-year-old leader to a 75-year-old leader. I mean, essentially, it tells you something about that political party. So you had these very, very fossilized secular political parties, and then you had the Muslim Brotherhood that was quite active, that was quite well organized, that was nonviolent, that had made a clear choice to act as a political party, but it was the only game in town. And that's how they ended up by gaining 20% of the parliamentary seats in the 2005 election. What you have now is a population that is very mobilized. And most of the people we have seen mobilizing in Tahrir Square were not the Muslim Brothers. Yes, the Muslim Brothers were there. They were part of the scene. But if you look around, if you, I don't know if you have in mind those pictures of people praying in Tahrir Square, what was striking is that most people were not praying. It was not the fact that there was a small group of people genuflecting, but in fact most people were standing around waiting for the prayer to be over. So what I'm saying is that there is really a shift here, that you no longer have this situation of the Muslim Brotherhood as being the only game other than the NDP, rather than the ruling party. So I really think the danger is not as great. Let me point out another thing. That is, in the 2005 elections, when the Muslim Brothers scared the Bush administration into stopping support for democracy promotion by winning 20% of the seats, only between 20 and 25% of eligible Egyptians went to the polls, which to me means that the 80% of the population decided that they wanted to have no part of either the ruling party or the Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that is important to keep in mind.
Although I assume that if the Brotherhood had been able to freely contest seats in 2005, which they weren't, and they chose to limit their own participation, I assume they could have won 80% of the seats at that time in a free election. Isn't that right?
But there was not, I don't think it would have been that high, because there are a lot of people who have very strong reservations. The point is that nobody was voting, that people did not turn out in droves to vote for the Muslim Brotherhood. And now you have a much more complex field. You are going to have many more political parties. You have many more organizations. The only danger is if the elections are held too soon, before the new political parties have time to consolidate. Even then, I don't think we are going to see this enormous groundswell of support for the Muslim Brotherhood. There is one more point, I'll just put it on the table, but I want to let other people talk for a moment here, is that we should also talk about the problem of radical Islam, because the Muslim Brotherhood is not the representative of real fundamentalist Islam. It's an organization that is functioning as a political party. There are the jihadi organizations in addition that should be kept quite distinct from the Muslim Brotherhood itself. I don't think they are a great danger either, because Mubarak did a pretty good job of getting rid of them. But in any case, let me leave it at that.
So you guys should feel free to jump in.
Well, I'm not as optimistic as Marina about how the Muslim Brotherhood will do in elections, although I agree with most of the rest of what she said. And I think that we want to be very careful. You know, Tahrir Square did have Muslim Brothers working in it, and they played a very important role, especially as things went along, in providing manpower for the protests and organization for the protests. But much more important than that is Tahrir Square is not Cairo, and Cairo is not Egypt. And if you leave Tahrir Square and, you know, the happy, fun Woodstock festival, people, you know, these young people coming together, regardless of ideology, et cetera, I think that that is a very small sector of the population. And you did have a very strong Islamist presence and role in organizing protests across Cairo, outside of Tahrir Square, in Alexandria, certainly in Upper Egypt, which is almost completely uncovered in the media today. And there's been a massive, as I know Marina knows very well, there's been a massive transformation of Egyptian public culture over the last 30 years in a much more conservative religious direction, which means that the terms of political debate have shifted far to the right, if you want to call that the right. And I think that you're going to see candidates from all different political parties trying to appeal to that base, because that's where the votes are going to be.
Have we, in effect, forgotten about that in the euphoria of Tahrir Square?
I'm afraid we have. Now, I don't want to be then with that direction of being overly alarmist about it, because I actually don't think that a Muslim Brotherhood victory would be such a terrible thing. But let me take a few steps before I get there. So what they are going to face, if things progress as they appear to be progressing now, is the elections are going to be held fairly soon, and they probably are going to face a very fragmented field.
Listen, what's your sense about when elections are likely to happen?
What was the last we heard? August?
The last is as early as June, the last that we have heard.
Earlier than originally it had been planned for October, right, before all this happened. So
No,
April referendum, June parliamentary election, September.
Although today they also have raised the possibility of having the presidential elections before the parliamentary elections.
It's still in flux.
Yeah.
The basic point is simply that the Brotherhood does remain very well organized at a time when most other movements and parties are going to be deeply unorganized. But the reason that I'm not as worried about this as that analysis would lead you to think is because the Brotherhood is extremely pragmatic and self-limiting. They are extremely attuned to the possibility. They don't want to scare the West or scare other Egyptians, so they're going out of their way to send signals. They will not field a candidate for the presidency. They will not seek a parliamentary majority. And so the lesson that they've learned from 2005 was that they won too many seats, that they were too scary. And so,
even though they chose to contest a tiny number for just that reason.
88 was too many.
Yeah, right.
That's what the deputy supreme guide told me. He said, 88 was too many. We should have gone for 44.
This is out of, 450 or something?
Yeah, we would have been fine.
So they chose to contest only less than a fifth of the seats.
So they're going to be pragmatic about it, and so I think that they will win up to the limit of what their own definition of what.
Well, let me just ask one other question.
That's what I expect to happen anyway.
Is the Brotherhood likely to splinter? That is to say, given that they've never really had to face an open political marketplace, and if you talk to folks in the Brotherhood, the gulf between the young guys and the urban guys and the older and the non-urban ones is enormous. I can't believe they'll survive as a coherent political party.
It's very possible.
To two points. First of all, we don't know that the Muslim Brotherhood is going to be allowed to run. The Article 5 of the Constitution that prohibits the registration of political parties with a religious framework has not been amended. It's not one of the articles that was amended by this commission. So that essentially, as things stand now, unless something happens, the Muslim Brotherhood is not going to be allowed to run. We don't know what the election law is going to say, because the way the Muslim Brothers ran in the past is by running as independent. Now, you can run as independent only if it is not a system of proportional representation, because in a system of proportional representation, you have to present a list. And that is difficult to do if you are not a registered political parties. And I suspect that we will have a system of proportional representation, because that's the way the government, the military is going to satisfy all these new small political parties, the youth movements and so on, that they get a few seats. And so that it's not a foregone conclusion that the Muslim Brotherhood is going to run. The second point about the splintering, I think it is already happening. First of all, something that people have for years now, after the 2005 election, the Muslim Brotherhood started dividing. It started dividing because what was the high point of their success, the winning of that 20% of the vote, also brought down the wrath of the government on them. They started having they increased the repression of the Muslim Brotherhood, the wave of arrests and so on. And that led to a lot of discussion within the organization saying, are we doing the right things? The reformers convinced us, the reformers in the Muslim Brotherhood convinced us that electoral politics was a good way to go. And what have we gained? We are not being allowed to present any laws, to have any impact on the parliament. We are all going to jail, essentially. And what you have at that point is two things. One, people who start talking about withdrawing from politics and going back, essentially, to leading the pious life, if you want. And then you have the youth groups that are, the Muslim Brotherhood has its own bloggers that are against the leadership of the Muslim Brotherhood. So that this process of dividing and splintering has already started. One last point, the government finally allowed in the last 2 weeks the registration of a political party called Al-Wasat, which is essentially a moderate splinter of the Muslim Brotherhood. That party had been trying to register for 15 years. And they finally allowed it to register, which is a deliberate policy of splintering.
So, but Mohamad, I want to apply this question to Bahrain, which you mentioned, which is, so as you pointed out, Iran may be a beneficiary of this, but that's different from saying that Iran is to some extent a cause of it, which you also read. So do you have the sense that Iran is actually actively pushing, maybe even in some meaningful sense causing this uprising in Bahrain?
I don't have a sense that they're causing this, and this is one place where they might be a beneficiary and might, because we also don't want to fall into, the Iranian regime will often claim credit for things that it can't do.
And certainly those who fear it will give it credit for everything.
Yes, we'll do the job for it. But there is, there's certainly a sense of, although the Iranians have a double-edged problem here, which we saw in their response to Egypt, that if they express too much gratitude to what's happened, then they're also, they deal with the irony of brutal crackdowns on their own protest movements. But on Bahrain, I think the Iranian direct influence has been overplayed, and the Saudis tend to overplay it, and so does the Khalifa family in Bahrain, as well as the other Gulf countries. There are legitimate grievances of the Shia majority in
But
Bahrain.
there seems to be, by the way, no national cross-sectarian sense of grievance, right? The Sunnis haven't joined this in the least.
At all, and that's what makes Bahrain, I think, especially dangerous, and creates these echoes of Iraq, of a very polarized and sectarian-based movements that have very little common ground.
So let's talk a little bit about Libya, since that's the top of the news right now. A couple things. One is, as Marina mentioned, the Muslim Brotherhood, however they're going to do or not do, is not extremism. It is in no sense whatsoever a kind of civilian wing of Al-Qaeda. Now, Libya is one of the places where you hear expressed the fear that should the tyrant be toppled, that vacuum could be filled by hardened fighters who Gaddafi had sent off to various other countries. The name of the organization is the LIGF or something. Yes. So should we worry in the case of Libya that if the good thing, desirable thing happens and Gaddafi is toppled, killed, whatever is gone, that could be the place where it will be a boon for extremists. Anybody, I'd be happy to anyone to answer that question.
Are you talking about the sort of scenario of Libya as another Afghanistan? Or sort of almost Pakistan
you can constitute the scenario as you wish. I guess the question is, given that you have a significant concentration of those folks who allegedly were rehabilitated by Gaddafi's son's foundation, and now are concentrated actually in Benghazi and those areas in the east that were first liberated, are they a significant enough force that there's good reason to fear that they will be empowered by the fall of Gaddafi, whether or not they'll literally take over the state? Okay. I guess that's the question.
Well, it's a very, unfortunately, we know very little about what's going on in Libya. I mean, I think this is, we know a lot about the Muslim Brotherhood. We may disagree about on some interpretation, but the Muslim Brotherhood is an organization with a street address and headquarters, and they are very accessible. You can go and talk to them. They have websites, they have publications, they have the best, their parliamentary delegation had the best accounting of what was being discussed in the parliament. I mean, that was if you really wanted to try and follow the parliamentary activity, you went to the web page of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's easy to talk about them. We don't know very much about these extremist groups in Libya, very frankly. We don't know much about the numbers. It's the only people who know something about them are people working in counterterrorism, and they don't know very much either, I would say. So that I really don't know how to answer the question.
A quick observation on Libya, and then we'll turn to Mark. I've seen, let's say in the past week, there's been, I haven't looked too extensively, but on some of the jihadist websites and then people who monitor the jihadist websites, there has been more commentary on Libya that sort of we told you so. You can't bring these regimes down except by force and by violence, and that they're willing and able to use tremendous violence. So I think the
fact of using violence plays into the Al Qaeda narrative in some sense. Yeah,
and that the regime, and so if we see Libya get more and more violent and more fractured, then I think that scenario you're painting it becomes a little more likely. But I mean, I don't think we have enough information, and it hasn't played itself out well enough for us to really figure out the likelihood of that.
Well, I'll just generalize this. It's like we don't know much about Libya at all. Not just about the radical Islamist groups, but generally speaking. And this gets to what Marina said right at the very beginning of this conversation, which is the difference between a state like Libya, and I would actually say even very different from Yemen, is simply the absence of a civil society with organizations with whom we have long contact and experience. Even in Yemen, there's a fairly well-established civil society that people in the West had relationships with, and they were points of entry into society. And when we start thinking what might come after Ali Abdullah Saleh, we have a pretty good sense of who the political parties are, the tribal confederations, the NGOs and civil society sector. And in Libya, I think it's a twofold problem. One is that it doesn't seem to exist very much. And secondly, to the extent that it does, we don't really understand it very well. In terms of the broader question about Al-Qaeda and radical Islamist groups, I mean, of course, they will try and take advantage of a turbulent environment which might be open to them. I think this is something which is comparable to Yemen, where ungoverned spaces then become a problem from a counterterrorism perspective, the Afghanistan-Pakistan problem. How big of a problem, I think it's very easy to exaggerate, but yes, it probably is a problem to some degree. Broader than that, I would say that Al-Qaeda, I actually think, is facing the current set of uprisings in a way similar to Iran in some ways, where in a sense, we have to be very careful how we talk about this. On the one hand, we don't want to fool ourselves. In hard power terms, this is probably good for both Iran and Al-Qaeda, in the sense that regimes that have been actively and effectively hostile to them have been weakened. And that gives them more space to maneuver and an ability to claim credit for things in which they had no hand in causing. So in the short term, it actually probably helps them in hard power terms. In soft power terms, it hurts them quite a lot because they have no effective way of inserting themselves into that narrative. Iran is not seen as an attractive model by the protest movements. Al-Qaeda is not seen as an attractive model by the protest movements. Iran cannot endorse, as Mohamad said. It can't go out there and push protest movements when it's out there killing its own protesters. And that's a fundamental fatal flaw. And Al-Qaeda can't very well say that there's no alternative except violent jihad when regimes are being changed through peaceful protest. So they've both been utterly irrelevant to the soft power, to the interpretation, to the politics of it. But at the same time, as I think what you're getting at is that in hard power terms, yes, things which have prevented them from acting are being removed.
But to go to your soft power point, I mean, isn't this in some ways precisely the fulfillment of what President Bush talked about in that famous second inaugural address, where he said that the greatest danger to the United States is the lack of freedom, the anger that simmers in the Middle East, and therefore, he said, it is the policy of the United States to promote democracy throughout the Middle East and end tyranny and so forth. The part that he got wrong was that the United States would have something to do with it, which it has not. But in terms of, but I'm happy if any of you think that's not right, but in terms of Marc's soft power point, should we not in fact be celebrating this moment as precisely the blow to the Al-Qaeda narrative, which people have been hoping for since 9/11?
The one thing I would say to that, however, is that I broadly agree with it. But Al-Qaeda is a kind of self-enclosed universe of reference which will find, it's not going to undermine their own feeling of self-worth. They are going to figure out a way to adapt to it as
their ability to attract adherence, though.
Well, exactly. So they will find other ways. They will try and find other points of entry. And so one of the things which worries me quite a lot is that we tend to project a certain staticness onto, Iran is losing, so therefore Iran has lost. Al-Qaeda is marginalized, therefore they've lost. Whereas in fact, they are adaptable and they'll try and find a point of entry. So, expect Al-Qaeda to want to carry out some big acts of terrorism. Blow something up in Tahrir Square, because that would change a narrative which is hurting them. And why wouldn't Iran want to try and spark a war on the Gaza border? If the game isn't working in their favor, change the game. And so I think that what I see right now is one in which both Al-Qaeda and Iran have been very badly hurt in soft power terms and probably strengthened a bit in hard power terms, but it's not necessarily what it's going to look like in 2 years, because they can see the same things that we can see.
Marina?
I don't think, I think probably Al-Qaeda is neither stronger nor weaker than it was before this started. It's not a player in this uprising. It has not been so far. I think you can be sure that the same groups that were operating in Libya before the overthrow of Gaddafi will continue operating in Libya. I think one of the biggest problems for Al-Qaeda in the entire organization, there is this group called Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, right? That's supposed to be I don't like the word franchise that people use, but essentially the regional organization of Al-Qaeda in that part of the world, that it's terribly splintered because nobody can abide the Algerians are trying to dominate it, and therefore the Libyans refuse to play in that particular sandbox and so on and so forth. I doubt that this is going to change as a result. I think it will continue pretty much. I agree with Mark that it's not impossible that they'll try to pull off some big terrorist act somewhere, because if nothing else, to tell people that they still exist and that they have not disappeared. But the other thing to keep in mind concerning Iran, that the Shia-Sunni divide is pretty deep in the Muslim world, and the idea somehow that Iran, I cannot foresee any kind of situation in which Iran is an important player has an influence on Egypt, for example. I think it's outside the realm of possibilities. If you know anything about those countries, you have to go back to the Fatimid Empire before you find the Shia having an influence in Egypt. I really don't think it's in the cards, that possibility. Bahrain, yes, because the majority of the population of Bahrain is Shia, although I suspect that they are not terribly interested in coming under the domination of Iran either. It's too much big brothers. Eastern Saudi Arabia, possibly, because again you have a Shia population, but most Arab countries don't have a very significant Shia. Certainly to the west of the Suez Canal, you don't find a lot of Shias, and it's difficult to conceive of Iran having much influence.
Although I will say I saw an awful lot of Hezbollah flags in Cairo in 2006. And the fact that it's a Shia organization didn't prevent them from being exceedingly popular with Sunni Arab populations.
But that's a different issue. That was the victory, this was the organization that stood up. I don't think it was support for Hezbollah as Hezbollah.
Well, certainly Mubarak feared Hezbollah inroads and talked about Hezbollah trying to secretly organize in Egypt.
No, but my point is simply that the Shiism was irrelevant, that Hezbollah, that Shiism dropped out. So I think in some ways you're right, but in another way, I don't see any reason to believe that it's impossible that Iran could gain influence by doing something which is popular with Arab publics. Right now, they're not doing things that are popular with Arab publics, but again, that's the sort of thing which could change.
So let me slightly change the focus. I'm very proud that we've gone a good 35 minutes without saying the word Obama. So we've had a totally non-Americo-centric conversation, which I think is really healthy.
Why do you want to change
We
it?
must change it.
Well, I thought I would anticipate some of the questions that would inevitably come from the audience. But I know I do want to, well, look, if you guys can pull the conversation back towards where it belongs, if you'd like. But I want to get just a little bit to the question of how the Obama administration has done, or whether it even matters. I mean, maybe the most important thing to say is whether they've done well or ill, it just doesn't matter. So Mohamad, would you say in the case of any of these conflicts we're looking at, whatever the Obama administration has done or has not done has been important?
In Egypt, it's been important.
Okay.
Because there's the leverage of 1.5 billion a year in aid, most of it to the military. I mean, I think I was rather critical of the Obama administration in the first days, but I actually think they've done well since then. I mean, Libya is its own problem. But you're talking about a change in policy that, usually takes years, if not decades, and they're being asked to make do and make adjustments really within days. And they're having to make adjustments to keep up with events on the ground. And they're having to think strategically about what comes next in years and decades. And it's impossible really for people to do all of those things and not have some missteps. And they're not going to please everyone. And the rhetoric, there was a lot of debate about Egypt and sort of what do you say when. The Frank Wisner mission to Mubarak, maybe botched, but
So that's
I'm
going
not
to be
entirely
forgotten about. That'll just be some minor detail.
be a
that'll
footnote
remembered
on this.
historians.
Yeah. But overall, I think they've done well. Libya. I mean, we have a number of things on the table, and we can talk about them. I'm not a military expert. I mean, I think a no-fly zone has a lot of drawbacks and problems, and there's a past experience with no-fly zones with the Kurdish areas and with southern Iraq. And that was not the best of experiences. It turned out better in northern Iraq than it did in the south. But on the whole, I think they've done well.
So, Mark, you wrote a piece a week ago saying it's time for forceful action in Libya and laid out a couple possibilities. So how do you judge how, let's just say we shouldn't say just the Obama administration, because that makes it seem like all external actors are Washington. So the broader question is, how would you say the international community, and by that I include Libya's neighbors and institutions like the Arab League, as well as the Obama administration, how have they reacted to this one, which is the most completely confrontational, doesn't involve diplomacy, involves the need to muster political muscle?
I think one of the crucial things here, and the way I started that article, was to say that it's a mistake to think about this as a comparable case to Tunisia and Egypt. This is like Bosnia or Kosovo or Rwanda, where you have the very clear manifest possibility of mass bloodshed carried out by a state against its own citizens, and that invokes the responsibility to protect at the United Nations. That weighs on our conscience. Our friend Sam Power is sitting there in trying to run this out of the National Security Council, and I'm sure that she's wondering what her own place in history, when someone writes the Samantha Power book about this, what will they say? And I think that is something which is going to weigh heavily on how they respond to it. So I think that when I call for a forceful response, I think there's things which should be done, and many of them are now being done. And I think that a lot of people criticize the Obama administration because they don't say the magic words at the right time. I think it's a really stupid way to judge them. What they did was, through quiet, patient diplomacy, they put together a unanimous Security Council resolution which put serious targeted sanctions on the regime. There's the prospect of referral to the International Criminal Court. There's now serious discussion of the enforcement of a no-fly zone through NATO. They're doing these things and maybe not in the grand rhetorical style, which Americans love so much, but I think they're getting things done. But their ability to get those things done is limited by their limited leverage over Libya, by the reservations of Russia in particular, because they still remember Iraq. They're not thinking about Kosovo, although they probably are, because they didn't really like Kosovo either. But the basic point is there's limitations to how much you can get done. I would support the enforcement of a no-fly zone, but I would deeply oppose any notion of an armed military intervention in Libya.
Is that because it could not work, or even if it worked, it would have more bad effects than good?
Both of those.
Why could it not work?
Well, we don't really need another land war in a Muslim country.
Okay.
Into a heavily armed population whose leadership, as best we can tell, is 100% opposed to the idea, doesn't want us there.
The leadership of the rebels.
The leadership of the rebels has been quite clear on this. And so it would be a terrible idea. Other ideas like arming the rebels, which I've recently seen bandied about by some members of the Senate, would also be a terrible idea. They're not asking for it. It would only make the situation worse. So when you say I call for a forceful response, yes, but not kind of a too forceful. Right. Okay. Marina.
First of all, just as a general answer to your first question, and then I'll come to Libya. What the United States does, by and large, matters a great deal to the future of the relation between the United States and Arab countries. It does not matter that much, except possibly for Libya, in terms of what actually happens in these countries. It's more of a question of the perception of the United States, whether it's standing on the side of change or it continues to support autocratic regimes and so on. But in terms of the actual impact on the change, I think it's fairly limited. Now, the issue of Libya, there was a great picture on Al Jazeera website today it's probably still up because I saw it just a few hours ago, of some of the protesters in one of, I think it was in Benghazi or one of the coastal cities that are in the hands of the protesters, with a huge banner hanging down what looked like a military fort in terms of the picture, essentially telling the West, we are doing this, you stay out. I think that's a very interesting picture to look at. And look at that and remember Somalia of the humanitarian intervention of the first Bush administration, and remember how that went, how badly and how quickly that went very bad. People don't like being invaded. I mean, the problem is that there is an argument to say, first of all, I don't think what we are doing now is going to change the situation on the ground. I think the thing that we should do very quickly, and that should be a no-brainer, is to send massive aid across the borders in Tunisia and Egypt, and see if we can send in some boats to take out those poor creatures, these Bangladeshi workers and so on, who have been camping out there and have nowhere to go and nobody's taking care of them. That is something that very definitely we can do, and it should be possible to do. But targeted sanctions, first of all, we know that they don't work very well. And if they work in the long run. So that these are things we are doing to appease our conscience and not because they are really very effective. A while ago, talking about the sanctions against Iran, Medvedev in Russia gave the best explanation. He said, we know that sanctions don't work, but sometimes you have to impose them. And I think it was very much, it's a question, it's almost a moral statement. We really disapprove enough. But if we think that somehow and I think this is a situation that's going to play out, at least that's my perception, fairly quickly. We are using a long-term tool, what is at best a long-term tool, in order to resolve a short-term situation. So it's really a moral statement more than an effective.
I mean, freezing their assets seems to be doing something. I mean, they're pretty.
Because
we're
not
talking about
freeze,
the largest.
Because you actually deny them access to military material.
Material resources.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and also and a post sort of. I think it adds to the sense of things closing in around them.
I would disagree only at one level, and that is that the fundamental thing which is necessary, and the reason, the logic, which I think unites all of the measures that have been taken, is that it's, and I agree, this is not so much about what's happening on the ground in Libya. This is about what happens because of Libya. And all around the world, there's a lot of dictators that are going to be facing threats to their rule, and they're going to decide, will opening fire with helicopter gunships on my people keep me in power or make me lose power? And what is necessary is to have a strong signal with international consensus that says, look, okay, you might stay in power for now, but then you're done. You are now a pariah in international society, suspended from the United Nations, with the members of the regime unable to travel, their financial resources confiscated, and if they ever leave their country, they're going to be seized and taken to the International Criminal Court. In other words, this will lose you power in the long run. And I think that's an extremely important signal to send, even if it doesn't have immediate effects on the ground, and even if it is just a more, I think it's more than a moral statement.
So that
I
may
think
take
it's a
the
signal.
Medvedev point another level, which is it may not help now, but maybe it will help in some future scenario. Let me just ask one more question, and I want to throw it open to all of you. Marina mentioned the imperative of humanitarian assistance in some of these cases. Now, tomorrow, Secretary Clinton is going to be testifying at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the whole question of foreign aid. And, of course, there's a big movement among the Republicans to severely cut foreign aid. Is money an important part of what should be the long-term American and more broadly international response to these movements? And if that's true, should that be a powerful piece of ammunition for those who are arguing that foreign aid is not just money given to salve your guilty conscience, but in fact has strategic diplomatic value? Any of you?
Carnegie Endowment for International Peace.
You go first this time.
Let's start. Is money overrated in terms of the importance of the things we can do, or is it really much more about diplomacy? Or in fact, is it going to be important to say, you guys fought and died and suffered, now you're in this new world, and we're going to give you lots of money, among other things, in order to help with this incredibly difficult transition you're facing?
Money is overrated in the sense that most of the time it's not used very effectively. I mean, a lot of foreign aid really has very, very little impact. It's interesting that the youth movements in Egypt were incensed when Hillary Clinton talked about redirecting this 150 million, and their reaction was, "My God, we need a Marshall Plan." Marshall Plan worked once. And Marshall Plan was a very special, massive aid program that was extremely effective because it went to solve a very immediate problem that Germany was facing. That was a shortage of foreign currency, essentially. That made a huge difference at a strategic point. The United States tried to repeat the Marshall Plan idea in India, in many other countries. It never went anywhere because you did not have the receptive ground, the people ready to use it. So yes, massive aid can work if it falls in the right situation. I would hate to see massive aid going into being lost into the Egyptian bureaucracy, because I don't think that much would come out at the other end after all. The best thing that the United States did in terms of foreign aid, in my considerate opinion, in terms of what it did in Egypt with economic assistance, is something that nobody wants to take too much credit for because it's not very aesthetically very pleasing, which was the reconstruction of the sewer system of Cairo and Alexandria. And having lived in that country when both systems were totally out of order, and very often you crossed, there were entire sections of the city flooded with sewer water. Believe me, reconstructing the sewer system was, in terms of, quality of life, for Egyptian citizens was one of the most effective things we ever did. Does that change the politics of the country? Of course not. This is really foreign aid, at the very effective but very basic. And I don't think we can manipulate a situation just by putting more money into it.
So Hillary should raise this transformed world of the Middle East tomorrow when she testifies? Should she say, here's another reason why we need to have a robust development assistance budget, because over the course of the coming years, we're going to need to be helping what we hope will be these infant democracies, et cetera?
I think you ghost wrote her speech for tomorrow, because that's exactly what she's going to say, maybe with a few changed words. I think she's going to frame it that way. Is it the right? Maybe divert some of the aid towards non-military uses, especially in a place like Egypt. Although one thing that often happens is that it does free up, when we subsidize militaries to this extent, it does free up the government to invest in other things such as wheat subsidies in Egypt's case. Yes, it does call for a rethinking of foreign aid.
Let me say two quick things. The first is that the kind of a long-term bugbear of mine that I'm sure most people don't agree with me on, but I actually think that democracy promotion assistance is mostly a waste of money and certainly doesn't produce democracy. And if you want to increase the odds of these infant democracies surviving, you should use your aid to help build the economy and provide jobs, because it's much more likely to. But that's in terms of, I imagine that, there very well might be the argument that's made in the Senate. I think it's not a very good one in terms of, well, now there's democracies, we have to increase money for democracy and governance programming. I'd say no to that.
But would you say we should increase funding for economic assistance for
Yes,
those countries?
yes, I would. And I think that one of the things which has always infuriated me about Washington is that, so just to go to another country which hasn't been mentioned at all today, amazingly enough, Iraq. For 7 years.
They already are a democracy.
That's right. For 7 years,
That's why they are all in the streets.
For 7 or 8 years, the Defense Department would ask for supplemental war funding bills, and the response of Congress was, "You only want $500 billion? Take 6." And there was never a question about it. And now that we're transitioning to, we're withdrawing our troops, and we're supposedly transitioning to a civilian mission, some friends of mine at State Department and Pentagon they were shell-shocked. They went to Congress, and their request, a tiny amount of money, was cut in half. And they weren't able to fund basic partnerships that they had already committed to with.
Is that because it was the State Department asking for money
Probably.
instead of the Pentagon asking for money?
Probably. And so I think, so half of me goes to the cynical, well, don't bother on this stuff. The other part of me says that we should be really thinking about making sure that we're actually investing in the kinds of relationships that we need to have, and that's where the kinds of foreign aid really does make a difference.
Great. All right, so let's stop here.
Can I add a couple of, just a footnote to this? That one problem that we have in the Middle East in terms of foreign aid is that we are competing with huge amounts of money that the oil-producing countries are providing.
Mm-hmm.
The U.S. aid in Yemen, it's less than 200 million, I think. The aid provided by Saudi Arabia is about 2 billion. We are not in the game in a sense in some of these countries.
Good point.
I'll stop there.
Are we hearing anything from the American neocons to push our war in Iraq as a way of spreading democracy in the Middle East? And secondly, what are the prospects for democracy within Iran? What can the international community do if sanctions are not working to weaken and pressure the Revolutionary Guard?
So just to rephrase that, so how do the neocons, does the neocons feel like they've been vindicated?
I thought you just wrote that.
Yeah, I did, but I'm here as the moderator.
Oh, so you're not going to go
so
first?
So do the neocons feel vindicated? One, and then two, what about Iran?
Elliott Abrams feels vindicated. He wrote a piece for the Washington Post even before Mubarak fell, saying that the policy was right on. He neglected to mention that in 2005, in late 2005 and early 2006, 6 months after Condi Rice's speech in Egypt, a group of judges tried to challenge the Mubarak regime, and they were crushed very quickly, and the Bush administration stood by silently. But yes, the neocons are vindicated.
And so Iran? Anyone want to take a shot at what the prospects for democracy in Iran are?
Actually, I want to stick with the neocons for a second because
This is such a juicy subject.
I could go on all night. But I will say that one of the things which has been most interesting is that when these upheavals really began to get started, you began to see a replay of this traditional thing. All these liberals think that Arabs can't be Democrats. And I got into this debate. I said, well, show me one. Show me one who says that. Whereas on the other side, the right was having a collective meltdown in which they were breaking very sharply, where some of the neocons, the true believers, and for everything you want to say about Elliott, he came down at least on the intellectual consistency side, where he basically said, you know what, I said we should have Arab democracy, and I still think so. And I would say a solid half or more of what used to be the neocon coalition saw Muslims and freaked out and said, oh my God, well, yeah, but we don't want Muslims in power. And so there's a fascinating debate going on the right, if you want to call it a debate, a division on the right now about how to respond to this, which I think is one which I'm very curious to see the outcome.
If I can now add one thing in, I've heard this debate inside one person. And so I was on a talk show, and right before me was James Woolsey, the former head of the CIA and a big neocon. And so Woolsey began by saying, let 1,000 flowers bloom. First Egypt, then Tunisia, then Iran, democracy everywhere. Then he said, but of course in Egypt we've got to move very carefully because those Muslim Brotherhood guys want to reimpose the caliphate, which is all about Israel in the end. And so the neocons are deeply divided between two different poles, which is this George Bush democracy thing, and then the deep affiliation with Israel and the fear that democracy in the Middle East means danger for Israel.
Yeah.
So,
And the Islamophobia part, which is
and the
a third
Islamophobia part. Yes.
Hi.
Stand up so that people can hear and see you.
Hi, Rita. Thank you for this discussion. So, going into Mansfield and Snyder, Edward Mansfield and Jack Snyder's kind of discussion about democratic transition and how they can be more volatile, you kind of briefly touched upon it. But do you think because these are endogenously developing these revolutionary democratic transitions, that they'll have a more optimistic future than the one that exogenously developed within Iraq?
Well, so if I can just briefly translate for the layperson. Mansfield and Snyder are two authors who have taken issue with the idea that democracy is automatically a good thing, and they pointed out that countries that are transitioning towards democracy, that are in between not democracy and democracy, are often extremely violent. Democracies may not have wars, but getting there democracies or fragile democracies often do. So, anyone want to take up that question?
Yeah, I don't think it makes any difference whether it comes from the inside or from the outside. I mean, first, change is destabilizing. By definition, you cannot have change and stability at the same time, so that there is always a moment of uncertainty in which all sorts of things can happen, and we don't know we don't know yet whether these are going to be democratic transitions. They are transitions, but we don't know where they are leading to. So the instability is certainly going to be there.
Just a quick follow-up to that. Do you see it as potentially likely that we will have the same kind of violence and terrorist attacks that have been kind of happening over the last 7 years within Iraq throughout the rest of the Middle East?
So will Iraq be a kind of paradigm?
Well, there's two different issues there. One is what happens inside the state. The other is whether the countries launch wars. And the violence inside, I'll leave that to Mohamad. But in terms of launching war, the thing which I think we should expect to see is that as all of these weakly institutionalized parties try and win votes, well, what wins votes is often demonizing foreign enemies and appealing to nationalist sentiment. And I would imagine that we're going to start seeing some serious Israel bashing in Egyptian political discourse in the coming years, and that's going to play very well with the base, and that's going to happen. And in a lot of other countries, when you start, I think you're going to see a lot of xenophobic, populist, nationalist kind of rhetoric in these arenas, especially if the economies fail to improve, which is almost certain. And there's going to be a lot of space there for populism, and it doesn't mean that it's inevitable. But if you look at comparative cases in other parts of the world, it's not impossible or unlikely.
Yes, sir.
Oh, sorry.
I was going to go back to what Mark mentioned about it, Al Jazeera and the picture he saw, sort of that, we don't want foreign interference. And my sister and her family just left Tripoli this weekend and got to Malta. And they said,
for
all
them.
the narrative. What's that?
Good for them.
Yeah, very good for them. We were very worried, and
I'll bet.
it was nice to know that they got there. And of all the narratives, all the discussion, all the things, and they were in a, I think, very typical neighborhood in Tripoli, and there's, of course, all kinds of discussions going on. But the one that sort of, because we had conversations in the last couple of days with her, the one that really rose to the top was this really powerful resentment about the international groups that are in Libya. Many of them there for business, many of them there around certain economic enterprises and so forth. And she said it was pretty universal about how people felt about, and it was across the board, whether it was Chinese nationals, whether it was the U.S., whether it was from folks from parts of Europe, who were involved in business and economic enterprises. And I'm wondering what is that kind of, what she said was very strong resentment about those groups. What does it mean for the future in terms of international involvement in many of these countries?
Let me try to address that. You could not do business in Libya without having a partner a Libyan partner, and those Libyan partners were people very close to Gaddafi and the family, very often were members of the family and so on. So that I think much of the resentment is due to that. I have not. It is quite likely that we'll see in all these countries, not just in Libya, a wave of what I would call economic nationalism taking place. I think you see it very clearly already in Egypt, where the military that has never been in favor of the neoliberal economic reforms is trying to roll them back as quickly as possible. So I think we are going to see a lot of I hope we are not going to see the nationalization of the oil companies, because that would put, Libya way back. But certainly that tendency of saying, these are our resources and we are going to exploit it it's already beginning to show in a number of countries.
And by the way, they weren't doing business there.
Yeah.
Not they
I want
themselves.
you to think, her husband's Libyan and they lived there and they were in a very typical kind of working class neighborhood.
Yeah.
They were part of the ones resenting the people they
Yes,
saw.
no, you made it very clear. You made it very clear.
Yeah. I just want to be clear on that.
Yes, in the middle there. Yes. Yes, I was pointing. Yes, please stand. So,
Thanks
yes.
all for your comments. I know it may be a little bit early to sort of hazard a guess on this question, but I'm wondering if the events that have sort of been happening in the Middle East represent some sort of rupture in the balance of power that has existed for the past decade between this sort of axis on the Iran end and then the sort of U.S.-Israeli axis on the other end, and whether or not this represents an opportunity potentially for Egypt to reclaim its moral leadership in the region and sort of create a non-aligned axis, if you will, between these two polarizing.
I think you're talking about sort of what's known as the axis of accommodation. The Sunni Arab states allied with the U.S. and the axis of resistance, which we hinted at earlier, or what calls itself the axis of resistance of Iran, Hamas, Hezbollah. I think it's a little early to tell. I think we're seeing Iran trying to cast it as the great victory of the axis of resistance until it runs into internal protests, and then it has to veer back and try to readjust itself. And I think Mark's point earlier, I think we're going to see a greater, in the political discourse in a lot of these countries, we're going to see a greater anti-American sentiment, a greater anti-Israeli sentiment. Now, is it going to lead to concrete actions? Probably not in the case of Egypt. We might see something along the border. We're going to see. I've been a little surprised, actually, in Egypt, because sort of the siege of Gaza is such an important point for average Egyptians. I've been surprised that hasn't been in the discourse in the past couple of weeks, and I'm sure it will come up again, as things settle a little bit, and there might be some popular swelling. We need to open up the border, at least on the humanitarian level, and then we have the problem of what will the Israeli response be, what will the response of the Egyptian military be. And those are all open questions. And we'll see Iran taking any kind of debate like that. Iran will quickly try to take advantage of it, at least on propaganda levels.
I think we are likely to see some change in the relationship, in the balance of power among Arab countries, more than a real shift in terms of, the kind of shift you were talking about. There was a vacuum in Arab politics. And it was essentially the fact that after 1981, Egypt kind of disappeared as a player in Arab politics, and after the years of Nasser, where it was the center of the Arab world, it was really a vacuum left there. I think we can expect, not in the next 2 years necessarily, because I think Egypt is going to have to deal with its own internal problems, that Egypt probably will try to be a force in the Arab world, but that's what's going to be. It's going to reignite the rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Egypt, rather than changing the balance of power sort of between Israel, the United States, and the Arab countries. I would be very, very surprised if anybody in Egypt was willing, of any persuasion, was willing to do anything that might lead to war with Israel once again. I think, I don't see that in the cards at all.
So, a couple of quick, very, very quick thoughts. First is that we're still dealing with the change in the balance of power caused by the removal of Iraq as a major player. And I think that a lot of what we've seen in Arab politics over the last 10 years, over the last 8 years, is still the playing out of what happens when you take the strongest state in the heart of the Arab world and remove it as a serious player. Secondly, I think that in terms of the balance of power, I think you're going to see a situation where internal stability is going to be a major factor. Are you a player or a playee? And you're going to see more attempts at subverting the other and in domestic subversion operations. So, like, for example, you take Qatar versus Saudi Arabia, I think that Qatar is going to be stronger relatively because it's so stable internally, whereas the Saudis will be relatively weaker because they'll have to tend the home front.
Just a simple question in the form of a proper noun. Missing from your crystal ball is a reflection of one sphere of turbulence, and that's Algeria, where there is no election still waiting to happen. A large population and an enormously wealthy country. I was in Tunisia 3 weeks before things blew, having dinner with the grandson of the founder of the state, Wes Bourguiba, and he said things aren't good here. But he wasn't at all clairvoyant.
So they were quite right. I somehow just forgot about poor Algeria. I apologize to Algeria, and I'd be eager to hear someone talk about Algeria.
I mean, what's fascinating about Algeria is that these protests have been going on for a long time, as opposed to, say, Tunisia. And so in that sense, it looks more like Egypt, where you have this like well-developed kind of protest movement and the like. But I think that also maybe gives a sense of, well, this is just Algeria. It's always been like that. And without, you don't have that sense of a sudden change. But I think you're absolutely right to draw attention to it.
No, it certainly can, something can happen. I think what is interesting in the case of Algeria, though, is that there is a certain, the Algerians had such a hard time in the, in the 90s, essentially, that there is a degree of caution, I think, that you don't, that you don't have in other countries. I'm not predicting that, therefore, we will have nothing more than the sporadic unrest that we have. But I think that's a country that has learned some very, very tough lessons in a very hard way in the past. So.
Yeah, in the to your right. Yes.
You briefly mentioned Qatar and Saudi Arabia. I was just wondering, one of the main things that I found very interesting about this is the role that Al Jazeera has played in these revolts. I'm wondering if you touch upon its role moving forward as sort of a major player in the region.
I mean, this has been Al Jazeera's revolution. I mean, this is in all kinds of ways. I mean, it has been the primary focal point for political debate and discussion and coverage. It's framed the protests, and I'm sure many of you watched this on Al Jazeera English or Arabic over the last bit. The other thing which is really important about Al Jazeera is that this is part of a frame that it's been developing, a narrative that it's been developing for the last 15 years. And so one of the things which I keep pushing back against in Washington is this notion that these protests are not about U.S. foreign policy, or they're not about Israel. And I think it's just wrong, because for Al Jazeera, it's all the same thing. That Palestine, American imperialism, the invasion of Iraq, and the domestic repression are all part of the same set of things which are oppressing the Arab people. And so I think that Al Jazeera has unified the political space. I mean, it's amazing. I don't know how many of you watch this, but to watch, on Friday they have this 5-way split screen of simultaneous protests happening in 5 different Arab countries using the same slogans and the same, and then it's not enough. They do this like flip thing and 5 different Arab capitals come up. And the way that they've unified all of this into a single political space has been developing. It's not new. This has been developing for the last 15 years. But I think that it really is something revolutionary.
Is there a hand that was over here that yes, I'm sorry, please. Yeah, why don't you stand up? Yes.
It's like, maybe this is sort of an esoteric question, but I'm interested in politics of identifying all of this as an Arab revolution and a Middle Eastern revolution, because the majority of the countries we're talking about are Northern Africa. And Sudan just split apart. And that's not a part of this discussion at all. And I'm curious as to why the discussion is, understandably Egypt sits at this axis of where, different regions split, but there's a different narrative, I think, possibly happening in Africa, and I'm wondering, maybe if you could speak to that a little bit and why this is taking an Eastern bent instead of a Mediterranean continental bent.
Again, that's a great question. For me, it's because of Al Jazeera. It's because Al Jazeera has framed this as a set of Arab uprisings and Arab revolutions, and it is happening all through in the Gulf also. So it's not just North Africa, but in a sense that they're framing it in that way, and it's largely being understood, I think, by the participants in that way, as their own identity is an identity with the other Arabs. But you can go south and you can look at things happening in sub-Saharan Africa, and you could put it into that model as well. But I think that's the reason certainly that I'm doing it, is simply following that identity as it's being framed by Al Jazeera and by the participants.
I would be very careful about overplaying the role of Al Jazeera, very frankly. The participants certainly are framing it that way. Al Jazeera, to me, reflects what has been going on. What strikes me in the way in which Al Jazeera has dealt with the story is the degree of professionalism with which they have covered the story. I think there are two organizations that have really provided very good, thorough coverage of what was going on in a highly professional manner, and those were the BBC and Al Jazeera. It's not, I have trouble seeing, yes, Al Jazeera is watched more in the Arab world because of Al Jazeera English, the Al Jazeera Arabic and so on, so it certainly has a further reach, but it certainly has been very professional in the coverage.
All right, yes.
There's an ominous silence from Damascus. I'm curious what members think about
Another
what
blank
will
space.
happen in Syria.
I'll talk about Syria.
Go ahead.
Thank you. I've been waiting for that all night. I'll be brief. Okay, so it's a great question, and I think I'm trying to sort of put myself in the mind of what must be going through Bashar al-Assad's mind when he sees, especially Libya, especially with what's unfolding in Libya. He's much more mentally stable than Gaddafi.
Yes.
But I think yes. Although he was this vanguard of young Arab leaders. He liked the internet, and he was on the internet. He was the head of the Syrian Computer Science Society before he became president. So there was great hope that he would be the harbinger of change in Syria, and it did not work out that way when he became president. I think there are three reasons why we're not seeing much of a movement in Syria. I think the nature of the regime, sort of an Alawite minority that rules a Sunni majority country. The Alawite minority, unlike Tunisia and Egypt, is in relatively strong control of the military and of basically all of the state security apparatus. And that was something that Bashar al-Assad's father ensured and handed over to him, and he was able to keep that. And even beyond just the Alawite, we're talking about also a family, almost a family-run country and an apparatus where a lot of the key positions are distributed to people connected to the Assad family. I think fear of the experience of Iraq, and that's something that the Syrians experienced because they were right next door to Iraq. They don't want a sectarian war. And they felt that much more than the Egyptians, than the Tunisians, than anyone in North Africa. They had, the estimates vary, but they had something like 1 million refugees from Iraq. So they felt Iraq a lot more closely than almost any other Arab country. And because Bashar al-Assad has been extremely effective at cutting off any hint of dissent or protest. And there's very little leverage that the rest of the world especially the U.S., has over him at the moment. The Europeans probably have a little more leverage, but he's been able to, survive under U.S. sanctions very easily since 2005, 2004, and there's very little that the West can do. So those combination of things, and I would put Iraq and the experience of Iraq first in that list, and I think it just can't be overestimated how much Syrians, I remember 05, 06, I spent a bit of time in Syria, and I had conversations with people, and these were what we would call the democracy activists, and they would say things like, we really don't want to end up like Iraq, and they would use terms like we prefer stability. It was shocking, and I think a lot of that has carried through until today.
So we have time for one more question, so let's make it a Lollapalooza. Is it a really great question?
Yeah, it's a great
It's a great question? Okay. It's a lot of pressure on you, though.
Can you speak to how you see all these uprisings and whatnot in the Arab world affecting the UAE?
Boy, we need Hassan for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's a good point. It's a very good point. Okay. What's the UAE answer to all this, if any? We need Hassan here.
Yes.
Well,
I guess one other way of rephrasing the question is, are there some places, we just talked about Syria. Syria may be invulnerable for reasons of successful repression. Are there other countries, we mentioned Qatar earlier, that are invulnerable for reasons of people not being alienated?
Okay, let me have a crack at this. First of all, I don't think there is any country where any of us can say it cannot happen here. It can happen, I liked what you said, but at the same time, if we we open the Al Jazeera website tomorrow morning and we find out that there are demonstrations in Syria, I would not be terribly surprised either. So I think any place can blow up in that sense. One thing perhaps that sets the Emirates, that makes the Emirates different is how tiny the indigenous population is. One thing that we often forget is that those countries, essentially, the Emirates are populated by foreigners by and large. My sense, whenever I go to the Emirates, is that you see an Emirati when he stamps or she stamps your passport when you get into the country, and then you see another when you leave the country and they stamp your passport again. It's really, I'm being a bit facetious, but not all that much, essentially. And I think that, and the percentage of foreigners is much higher than in any of the other Gulf countries. So that may be one factor, but I will not...
I just want to add that we here at NYU are very proud that we actually teach Abu Dhabi Emirates. We have direct contact with the native people.
All three of them?
And on that note, well, thank you all very much. Those were excellent questions and excellent answers.